I am the great niece of an accused conspirator in the JFK assassination. Guy was an angry drunk, impulsive. He was pulled over for driving drunk. He pistol whipped Jack Martin. He was doing all of these violent acts. Because of his behavior, he handed his enemies all of these openings to take him down. And what I wish people would understand is that he was a wild anti-civil rights proponent, but at the same time, he hated the Klan and prosecuted the Klan. He was adopted into the Ogallala tribe in Oklahoma for services rendered to the tribal members. So it's not a very clear cut, this is a bad person. This is a complicated person who did a lot of good and a lot of harm. And you have to look at him as a whole person with all those layers to really understand his role in New Orleans with Oswald.
What would you do if a family member was accused of having something to do with one of the most heinous crimes in American history? Would you sit idly by? Would you join the tide of people against him? Or would you do what Janet Banister has done and do the research yourself? Today we're going to hear from Janet, niece of Guy Banister, accused of instigating the assassination on John F. Kennedy. Let's find out what she has to say and what she's uncovered. Because Guy Banister was a complex individual, dedicated to his larger family, not as dedicated to his own wife, dedicated to his country, but didn't care for the president. Lots of twists and turns. Let's take a listen and see if we can make anything, be a little bit more clear.
My great uncle's name was Guy Banister, and I grew up hearing stories about him from the time I was very small out on the ranch in eastern Montana. And Guy and my father were relatively close as my dad grew up. And so it had always bothered me from the time I was young, not knowing the truth as to whether he was involved or not.
All right, to start, I am so excited to bring to you a completely different kind of guest. And I met her in a podcasting group, and we thought that this would be a really interesting conversation for you. So I would like to introduce Janet Banister, and I'm going to let you say, who is Janet?
Well, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to be on today. My name is Janet Banister. I am a neurosparkly choir teacher. I love teaching middle school. I have a lot of hyperfixations that I've studied on for 20 years. And having started this podcast, I got to put all of those hyperfixations all in one very cool package for this podcast called Skeletons in the Closet, Family Secrets.
And somebody else that you are pertains to today's interview, which, it was an interesting thing to research, especially because I think when I research somebody as a neutral third party, that's one thing. But if I research somebody as it pertains to someone else in their family, it's a whole different thing. And the person that you're related to, it's a roller coaster of research, let me tell you. And so, but we're going to talk about it honestly, but also gently, because I don't think there's any reason not to do that, because it's family. And for everybody watching, you got family. And so we're going to treat this how you'd want your family treated. And if you want to go do more research, you can do that. That's how I'm going to leave that. We'll have some links that you share with us for people to go do more research. But do you want to tell them who it is that you are related to?
So I podcast under my maiden name of Banister, and I do that for a couple of reasons. And the biggest reason is that I am the great niece of an accused conspirator in the JFK assassination. My great uncle's name was Guy Banister, and I grew up hearing stories about him from the time I was very small out on the ranch in eastern Montana. And Guy and my father were relatively close as my dad grew up. And so it had always bothered me from the time I was young, not knowing the truth as to whether he was involved or not. And I had noticed that especially in the last 5 to 10 years, more and more records were becoming available online that I could look up and see, what the actual truth could be. And so with talking with my father, his brother, my Aunt Linda, and some extended family members, I decided to launch my first podcast on whether or not he was possibly involved, and also to explore the question as to why the way he was portrayed in Oliver Stone's movie was so very different than how we remembered him as a family. And so exploring those two questions has taken me down a wild roller coaster of a ride. And I've learned a lot of things. I've learned some things I almost didn't want to know. And I had to make a lot of decisions as to how to communicate.
Did you meet him growing up?
I did not. He died in 1964. But he was such a constant topic of discussion in my home that I felt like I knew him anyway. And my grandfather was Guy's brother. Guy started in the FBI in 1934. He was in the FBI before it was actually even the FBI officially. And my grandfather was his younger brother. And when my father was, I think he was about 4 or 5 years old, his father disappeared in Alaska and was never found. And so Guy stepped in a lot of ways with my father and his siblings as like a parental figure. He wasn't constantly in their lives because they lived so far apart, but he was definitely someone they visited a lot and that my dad and his siblings looked up to quite a bit. He was a very, very complex human being. He had very rigid views about how the government should operate and also how people should comport themselves in public. Those rules didn't apply to things behind closed doors at times. And I think he's one of those people, especially when he was young, that you could have trusted him with just about anything dealing with his job, but not so much at home. However, he was very good to his nieces and nephews. His relationship with Aunt Mary, his wife, was pretty tumultuous, but he was very good to the nieces and nephews.
Interesting. So for those who are listening who don't know what we're talking about and don't understand what the story is, I thought I would let you tell it. Much better for you to tell it.
Janet Banister was born in 1901 near Monroe, Louisiana, and he was the oldest of 7 kids. My grandfather was his younger brother. He was, I can't remember exactly the age span, but he was quite a bit younger than Guy. And he held a lot of odd jobs, but his father, my great-grandfather William Henry, was a sheriff's deputy in Monroe for the parish. And he, after holding a couple odd jobs as like a clerk, he joined the Monroe Police Department, and I believe it was the police department rather than the sheriff's office. In 1934, Hoover is still fairly new in his role as the director of the Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't yet the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but he recruited Guy to join, as the story goes. And Guy, by July of that year, had been accepted into the FBI. And so he joined in and shortly after was involved with helping take down John Dillinger's gang. There was a lot of historians recorded him as having been at the shooting of Dillinger. And so I think that was likely a misnomer. He had a kind of a tumultuous career with the FBI. He kept getting kicked to the least desirable posts. One of which was called, they called it the FBI's Siberia. That's Butte, Montana. And ironically, he got kicked to Montana before my family arrived in Montana. At the time, my grandfather and grandmother were in Alaska. And shortly after my grandfather disappeared, Grandma came back down to the lower 48 with my dad and his siblings, and they visited quite a bit. There's lots of stories about his time in Butte. It wasn't uncommon for people to get assigned to Butte as punishment, and then they realized it's actually a pretty awesome assignment, and so they would stay. So he was in Butte for 10 years. He also served in counter-espionage during World War II. And there's a fantastic story that I could not verify. I still have not found the source for it, though I suspect it was likely a detective magazine. It's been claimed that he actually raided the German embassy in Mexico and bugged it and stole documents from the safe. And so he was one of what they called Hoover's black bag men that had counter-espionage training. After the war, he came back. He was bounced around between Oklahoma City and Butte and then later to Chicago. And there was a large kerfuffle of some sort in Chicago, which I've been trying to I think I know what happened, but I don't know 100% for certain what happened. But he got into trouble with a future vice president, the Secretary of Agriculture under John F. Kennedy. And he retired from the FBI, citing his daughter's health, and then was hired by the New Orleans Police Department as an anti-corruption officer. This is where things get very, very murky and very, very contentious. In the 1950s, at some point, he had a stroke of some kind or suffered some sort of brain damage. And family recollections of what was going on at that time, Dad is pretty sure it was a stroke. Anthony Summers recorded it as him having suffered brain damage during a surgery. Either way, it's fairly certain that he had some sort of damage going on. And his behavior became very erratic, impulsive, and very violent. And so in one way, the way he was portrayed in Oliver Stone's movie was rather accurate because that's how he was acting at that time. But that wasn't who he was the previous 50 years of his life. And so from there, it becomes a matter of how connected was he to the CIA? How connected was he to the FBI? How connected was he to all of these anti-communist activities? And that is where things get really, really murky.
In Oliver Stone's movie, they portrayed him as being like that, like very edgy and violent and grumpy. And yeah. And Ed Asner played him, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, because I watched a clip of it before we talked, because I thought, I just want to make sure, that I know. And so the story goes that it appears as though he and Oswald did have some sort of connection before. Is that true? In the research that I was doing, there were certain people that were saying that there are documented things of them actually having contact together.
When I say that that's kind of a murky time, that is exactly what I'm referring to, because multiple people have seen them together. It does not mean, however, that was collusion.
Oh, exactly.
And that is where, and that's where things get dicey, because the sheer number of witnesses that have contacted the authorities with, I saw Oswald here, and here's my description. Fred Litwin does a very good job in his book on the Garrison Commission of documenting all the times in which people claim to have seen Oswald and it couldn't physically have been true. And Oswald and I believe David Ferrie, I'd have to go back and look, having overheard them at a party talking about how they were going to kill Kennedy. And she was never able to produce evidence of that to my knowledge. I'm not saying it doesn't exist because you can't prove a negative, but I'm saying I have not found it. It becomes very tricky because Guy was, number one, kind of a jerk. He was a jerk to everyone around him. And more so, and what crushes my heart is that how he treated Mary. And I did not meet Guy, but I did meet Mary. And the way that he used and abused Mary, I don't know if he was physically abusive. I kind of doubt it. I haven't seen any evidence of that. But he betrayed her on a regular basis. And they were actually, at the time of his death, separated. They were in the process of divorce, but the divorce wasn't final before he actually passed away in his office. I believe, was it his office? I'd have to go back and look at the coroner notes. But at any rate, it gets really difficult because there is a principle that was used by Jim Garrison to prove that people are colluding together. And all it really is, and he called it it's really hard to say, propinquity, I think. I'd have to go back and double check my notes. But Garrison has determined that if these people all know each other, they have to be in cahoots. And just the fact that they know of one another or know each other proves that therefore there's a conspiracy. And that particular concept has done more damage to JFK research than any other kind of idea, because just knowing somebody or being aware of them does not mean you're in cahoots, and it's taken as evidence. So what Guy told Ross, Uncle Ross was Guy's another brother. What Guy told Ross is that Oswald was leafleting close to his office to twist his tail, just to kind of mess with him and make him mad. That could be true, or they could be actually colluding. It's very difficult to say because many of the witness statements that propose that they were colluding are from deeply problematic sources that have enormous credibility problems. And I do believe, having done especially in the last 3 weeks, the research I've done in the last 3 weeks, I do believe that there was personal animus and underlying issues behind the main accuser, which was Jack Martin. And so it's really difficult to determine what his relationship to Oswald really was.
Well, and what doesn't make sense to me is that, Oswald's big thing was that he was pro-Castro, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Guy was not pro-Castro. He was the opposite of that. So it doesn't make sense to me. I haven't done clearly as much research as you have, and other people. But just on the face of it, it seems as though they're in completely different camps. And why in the world would they work together on something so big? If one is because back then the communism thing, that was a big thing.
Guy was anti-communist, heavily anti-communist at a time it wasn't weird to be anti-communist. However, he was so anti-communist that even people at that time in that setting thought it was a little bit, wow, he's really intense about this kind of thing. And so that sword cuts both ways. If you look back even from the 1930s on, there's a lot of propaganda put out by J. Edgar Hoover on communism, even from the first days of his tenure in the Department of Justice. And that has an effect on a person, especially when his relationship with Hoover was so weird. I genuinely think they were friends because they stayed in contact until right before he died. Like several relatives and secretaries over at the Banister Detective Agency reported Hoover giving him calls now and then. And I spoke to an FBI agent who served under Hoover in that same time period, and he was adamant that if Hoover was calling you after you had retired, it was 100% personal business, in that Hoover was another one that was very rigid about certain rules and very lax about others. But that happened to be one that this agent believed was fairly rigid, that he would not be contacting Guy off the books for work for the FBI because it was against policy to do contract work for the FBI. So it does make it incredibly challenging.
So what I would, in my research, the only thing that I found that would make it make sense in any way that they work together is that Guy thought that JFK was too lax on his dealings with Castro.
You have that sentiment correct, because he actually told my father that when he was still alive. That was the source of animus for his extreme hatred of Kennedy, was the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and that he was soft on communism. The best explanation I've heard from folks who are pro-conspiracy who felt that he was involved is that they were both being paid by the CIA to collude and kill Kennedy, but using that anti and pro-communism as a cover. What Guy told Ross, and what my dad believes is very firmly, is that he was actually surveilling Oswald and keeping tabs on him, because that's what he was doing for a lot of people at the Banister Detective Agency. A lot of his files were his surveillance of people he believed who were communists. And I actually believe that is likely what caused the kerfluffle up in Chicago and in Minnesota. The future VP and Secretary of Ag, is that I think he accused Hubert Humphreys of being a communist. I found some documentation to support that, but I don't have a direct correlation. I can't read the signature on the letter that I found in the FBI vault, but the letter was written at the time that Guy would have been up there, and about Hubert Humphreys being a communist.
So one thing, you said something about his hatred of JFK. He did not like him.
No. But another thing about context, and I hate using the word context because there are so many people who are absolute raging a-holes that shout context whenever their actions are being justifiably called out. But I genuinely want to set this in the context of the times, is that JFK's numbers were very low, and his approval rating, it was very low. And there was a very large contingency of the population in the United States, especially in the South, that hated JFK. The sheer number of threats that are levied against every sitting president is immense. How many of them are serious is a much smaller number, and how many actually attempt is an even smaller number. So just hating somebody is not evidence. There are hundreds of threats against the presidents, probably every year, every month maybe. And just hating JFK is not evidence.
So is there anything, because I have so many questions, but there was a lot of things said about your uncle. Did your family ever consider taking any kind of legal action to challenge any claims made about him?
Mary had told Dad that I think the word was, we're going to sue all those sons of bitches, I think is exactly what Mary had said, who were defaming Guy and his name through the mud. The issue you have is in New Orleans, and the corruption was so intense that the chances of that lawsuit going anywhere would be rather tricky. And the levels of corruption and how heavy they were dates way back.
What do you wish people understood about the gap between the conspiracy theories and the documented facts?
I wish that folks could be more aware of bias. The problem with bias is that it's sometimes so deep you don't even realize it's there, and you can't fix what you don't know. And the Oliver Stone movie created an intense and very subtle bias that's pro-conspiracy. And because of propinquity being such an integral part of that movie, it has entered kind of like the cultural zeitgeist that if you have a relationship with somebody who's shady, you must be involved. And it's an uphill battle to differentiate between fact and propinquity. I believe he created that word. I could be wrong about it, but I'm grateful he named the topic, because it's also easier to name to fight against it. But that has done so much damage. And just the fact that Guy was an angry drunk, impulsive, he was pulled over for driving drunk. He pistol whipped Jack Martin. He was doing all of these violent acts. Because of his behavior, he handed his enemies all of these openings to take him down. And what I wish people would understand is that he was a wild anti-civil rights proponent, but at the same time, he hated the Klan and prosecuted the Klan. He was adopted into the Oglala tribe in Oklahoma for services rendered to the tribal members. So it's not a very clear cut, this is a bad person. This is a complicated person who did a lot of good and a lot of harm. And you have to look at him as a whole person with all those layers to really understand his role in New Orleans with Oswald.
He was definitely a complicated person, I think that is. So looking ahead, what would you most like scholars and the public to remember about Guy Banister?
I'd like to have them be able to perceive all those layers, because the humanize is the wrong word. I would like him to be seen as a whole person instead of a caricature, so that he doesn't get ascribed actions to him that he did not do. Because what matters to me intensely is the truth. And many people say, and this is where I'm probably going to get in trouble, and I'm probably going to make people mad when I say this, but I'm just going to say it anyway. There are a lot of folks who say they are interested in the truth and they only want to know the truth, when in fact their motivation is they want their narrative supported. And I am not a big fan of narratives. I am much more of a fan of truth. And what has historically been a trend in JFK research is that those who construct the best narrative are the ones who have the loudest voice and the widest platform, when sometimes they are leaving out exculpatory details. Garrison would probably be the most egregious of them all. He's left out anything exculpatory for those who he was accusing. He ran with witnesses he knew lied. He ran with witnesses he threatened. But it's his voice that has been the loudest, especially because he managed to get his hooks into Oliver Stone, who made, if you look at that movie, it's a very well-made movie, very well written, and with good acting, with great stars. And but the damage that has wrought for decades is inexcusable. And I would like Guy to be remembered as an example of what happens when you buy into a charismatic narrative as opposed to the truth.
What happened to he had all these folders and reports and things on different people, and apparently he had one on Oswald. Do you all have that? Who has that?
So backstory on that, I had to laugh. I was talking with Dad one day out at the ranch, and our ranch house is a very big house, and it's been inhabited by Banisters for 3 generations. So there's a lot of stuff there. Okay. But I was mentioning offhand that I had filed another FOIA request trying to locate the files you were just talking about. And Dad says, well, I got some around here. And I went, Dad, do you know how many people have been looking for that stuff? And then it turns out, well, like, he buried the lead a little bit. It was about his files from when he was in Oklahoma, not when he was in New Orleans. And so the search for the files has been the most exhausting and exhilarating part of this entire thing. There's a lot of wordplay that happens when you're talking about those files, because I had some folks say, hey, so-and-so knows where those files are. And so I would contact so-and-so, and they'd say, oh, well, these were just the files from the Bannister Detective Agency, not those files. And so it was this constant kind of circus running around trying to find these files. And then there was some of his files Mary sold because Guy had run them so much into debt. She was just scraping for every penny just to survive. She sold for $500 some of his files to the Metropolitan Crime Commission, some of them to the Louisiana State Police. I hope that I can add to the body of literature in a way that's helpful and not harmful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
What do you think? Do you have any more idea of whether or not Guy did or did not have anything to do with it? Let me know in the comments.